Hi guys, Janica here from Multispective, and I'm here to share with you a new episode where I interview Renee Rodriguez. Really interesting story. She was in a very mentally abusive marriage.
He was especially cruel that day, and this was within 2 weeks of my friend having told me I was being mentally abused.
And eventually had come to terms with the destructiveness of the marriage that she was in and decided to leave it. So she called a DV center and got help and assistance with exiting that marriage, and then decided to fight the battle on her own.
There was this moment when I knew that I had to get out. There was, several feet of snow. My son is 5 months old at this point. He's in a baby carrier. I'm, got a suitcase that I'm trying to pull behind me on the Brooklyn streets. I escaped.
So she talks in great detail about how that journey of the separation, of fighting her own battles, of winning custody over her child, and now she has decided to make a career out of it. So she is currently a custody strategist. So, if you are going through something like this, or anyone that might be struggling with the separation and custody for their children, this is a really useful and informative episode for you. Wait to hear from you guys. Don't forget, drop a comment below. It's so lovely to have you on Multispective. Welcome to the podcast. Renee, why don't we start off the episode with you sort of telling us a little bit about you and your background?
So my background is one of, I'm a woman of mixed heritage. What was instilled in me were these Puerto Rican values, very strict, very rigid. You're raised in a certain way. At a certain point, I met somebody who was amazing. I knew he was my soulmate. He was so doting. He was so attentive. He was finishing my sentences. He had almost every little thing in common with me. And we spent some time together, and rather quickly, I would say about a year in, he started turning abusive. As a matter of fact, after about the umpteenth time of sitting and talking to a friend to say, I need to do better. Can you give me some advice? How can I fix myself in this relationship? How can I do better? How can I do what he asks? She said, you know what? I've got to say this to you, Renee. I think you're being mentally abused. So after that, having that awareness really gave me the opportunity to take a look at the way I was being treated. And I ended up escaping. I ended up calling the DV hotline, told them, I'm not sure this is abuse. He hasn't laid his hands on me. I've seen him be violent, but not with me. He's doing this, he's doing that. They were finishing my sentences. And they said, this is severe emotional abuse. We think you should just go while he's at work. Don't wait.
Wow. I mean, here, it's such a tricky thing because whenever we think of abuse, our brains naturally go to looking for the scars on the body to see if this person has been abused. And if it's not, then, sometimes the victim gets blamed for it too. Then it's like, oh, well, why didn't you have that strength to be able to stand up for yourself? Like, you're a grown adult. And there's just so many directions it can go when it comes to something that's non-physical. And when it is a physical, that's when people start to sympathize maybe a little bit more, or kind of can label it a little bit easier because, it's a physical scar on a person. Can you tell us some of the scenarios that you were telling your friend that led your friend to think to give it the label?
Right. Nobody starts dating somebody who's cruel to them.
Right.
They're wonderful. And then they become controlling, and then they become blaming, and then you're trying to fix things. And for me, the way that this manifested was, there was one point at which I was putting together a rehearsal because at the time I ran a theater company, as a matter of fact. And the rehearsal ended up being in a venue that what we had expected was not what we got. And my ex and my boyfriend at the time was livid with me, livid. He blamed me for it, and he spent about 3 days not talking to me, giving me the silent treatment because of that. There was another time in which he came home and he slammed the door. And I said, oh, hey, what's wrong? And he said, I'm very angry with you. To which I was at home. I was just doing my thing. What could possibly have happened? And he said, I lost my folder. And I said, oh, okay. I'm kind of waiting for where I come into this.
Yeah.
And he said, I know where I lost it. I think it was at the grocery store, and I know why I lost it. And it was because I was thinking about you. And so because I was thinking about you, instead of staying focused, I lost my folder. And that was an important folder, and on and on and on. Another 2 to 3 days of code of silence. There was another time in which he bumped his shin getting off the city bus. And that was my fault too, because he wasn't paying attention because I popped into his head. I mean, it was psychotic. But when you're in it and when it starts happening slowly, right? One of the slower things being, hey, I'm going out with my friends. We always go see a play together about once a month. To which his response was, well, you don't need to do that anymore. You have me now. I'm the person who should be going to see shows with you. I'm the one who should be going here with you. I'm the one who should be. So I didn't realize I was being isolated, right? And I was being given a choice. If I chose my friends over him, then I wasn't really dedicated to the relationship. I wasn't really committed. I didn't really love him. These days, any website and take some sort of a quiz, look at some sort of, set of check boxes as to what defines narcissism. I was hitting most of them. And later when I took that quiz, it was 9 out of every 10 things you could choose was what I was experiencing. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not being committed enough. Right? Or, it seems crazy to me that he would be angry that he lost his keys, his folder, he hit his shin, this, that, and the other thing because of me. But, am I infringing on him too much? What am I doing to stay in his mind too much?
Like for someone on the outside hearing that a person has lost their folder because they were thinking about you and, blaming you for it, it sounds absurd. But in that very moment, was he having to sort of explain that to you, or were you sort of like almost absorbing it on your own as well because of the way he was saying it and the lead up to it?
Most of these narcissists are very practiced in what they do. So there is the indoctrination, right? There is a whole, there's the love bombing, which, some of these terms used to be terms nobody knew, and now they're all over TikTok, right? So love bombing sounds like this thing where it's like they're being wonderful to you, and what's so wrong with that? But I feel like I want to pause, I want to explain that love bombing is carefully watching that person and carefully seeing, how cruel can you be? What kinds of things can you do? What kinds of things can you get away with saying, and then quickly apologize and maybe even take it on yourself that you did something wrong? They slowly indoctrinate you. And when they do something where they see they've gone just a little bit too far, they've done too much, then they're quick to come back and say, you know what, let's go out to dinner. And then I think people picture flowers and all that type of thing. Maybe. But often it's actually more a mental thing. It's more sort of like, I want to share something with you I've never shared with anybody. But I feel like with you, I can finally say this. And so you're ensnared, right? This person needs you and they can be decent. And gosh, who would I be to just reject this sensitive, wonderful person when they just had a bad moment, when they're just going through a rough patch at work?
Oftentimes they say in order for a relationship to sort of like reach certain depths, there is a vulnerability that needs to be sort of like let out in a relationship. You do need to share some of your darkest parts of you or your deepest parts of you. So how can you draw the difference or tell the difference between a person love bombing versus being vulnerable and just trying to be honest?
I don't think you always can. And I think the first thing you have to remember is that the red flags, if they're very good at what they do, which most of them are because they employ cognitive empathy, which is not empathy, then essentially they can spend a very long time with you not displaying any flags. And then if something does pop up, it does become a question of, gosh, everything's so wonderful. This one thing happened. Am I really going to reject this human being. We're all flawed. Am I really just going to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because I'm identifying this flag? The simplicity of just leaving somebody, I think that's absurd. There are so many things that are at play. Your upbringing, your religion, the voices of your friends, who you're around, the situation you're in financially, on and on and on. And so to make it as simple as leaving this person who, truth be told, is actually quite lovely and doting and attentive most of the time, I don't think that that's a realistic thing to put on most people. However, the other piece of it we have to consider is that most, but not all, of the people who are targeted by this type of insidious individual are people who have been identified as, for whatever reason, not having strong boundaries, whether it's in this period in their life or whether they just were not built up because this person, this target did have a childhood that had holes in it. Really, Pete Walker talks about this when you're, trying to heal complex PTSD, then, he talks about the fact that there's usually at least one parent, probably one parent, who has created these holes in your ability to understand that boundaries are okay and here's what they look like. And
Right.
so this kind of person is who a narcissistic abuser is seeking.
What was that for you then?
I was definitely in a vulnerable moment. And when I look back, it's I can go into a million different things, but the bottom line is I did not feel loved as a child. When I look back, I can see that I was lucky to not have horribly abusive parents so much as parents who were in a situation that was economically very, very poor. So my father was busy putting food on the table, so I wasn't able to build a relationship there. And my mother was someone who was ancestrally, generationally abused, physically, mentally, every which way you can be abused just about. There isn't an anger with my parents so much as there is a recognition of these things, which then, of course, when you think about it, Jenica, leads to, okay, how do I make sure, as someone who was with somebody who is abusive, how do I make sure that my own child doesn't take on these things, right? How do I make sure first that I am never taken in by an abuser again? And how do I make sure that my son doesn't pick up whatever these things were that my mother brought with her, that her mother brought with her, that I may be bringing with me, even though I am without a doubt the most aware out of any of the generational women for me, of what is out there, of who I am in it.
And I get it exactly what you said about, sort of the very first step towards sort of ending generational trauma is having that awareness of it. How long had you been with him before it really kind of occurred to you?
So my friend told me I was mentally abused after we had been together for 2 years. So I was lucky that it was only 2 years. Certainly when I'm working with, parents now, it's much, much longer, 6, 10, 15, 20 years.
Would you say that there is a time frame for the depth of the trauma that an individual can have? How would you categorize the traumas of emotional abuse in a relationship?
I think it would absolutely be worse for the people I'm working with because these are parents. And so one of the things that most of these parents feel that they can never forgive themselves for, even though obviously they should, but I understand, is that in this case, with this person who is crashing through their boundaries and treating them cruelly, they have created children. And so the court system is going to ensure that they are never free of abuse.
And so you noticed it. How did you escape? How did you get out of your situation?
I don't know how to explain it other than there was this moment when I knew that I had to get out. He had blamed me because I asked for his help to Google something, to do a web search on something quite simple. You open up a page, you look up something, but I was incapacitated at the time and just asked him for help out. And he happened to be uploading an important video, excuse me, for his job. The video would not upload, which I think we've all encountered again and again. But he decided to blame me because he had opened up a Google page to look up something for me. And he was especially cruel that day. And this was within 2 weeks of my friend having told me I was being mentally abused. And so the next day I called that very same friend. And like I mentioned, I called the DV hotline. I'm frantically putting things together, a bag together. And I'm just, I escaped. There was, several feet of snow. My son is 5 months old at this point. He's in a baby carrier. Got a suitcase that I'm trying to pull behind me on the Brooklyn streets. My friend is holding two of my other bags. The majority of what I brought was, of course, for my baby versus me. And I stayed with her for a few days, and then we kind of couch surfed for a bit. The fury with which my ex responded was frightening. Absolutely frightening. I was receiving text messages with pictures of my possessions saying, just throwing things out until you come back. He showed me pictures of things that were precious to me from my childhood that were in our home. And he said, this is gone now. I still haven't heard from you. This is next. And it was just torturous for me to say, well, am I going to bring my child back into that home to get, him to stop getting rid of my possessions? Or am I going to watch my life be thrown into the incinerator while protecting me and my child? And I did choose the latter. He was going through all different kinds of things to get me back. There was destroying my stuff and sending me pictures. There was threatening me. There was, cajoling. There was, promises. There was, let's get into counseling, which I begged him for, which I'm glad we didn't do because, man, let me tell you what, therapy, I now know with an abuser is just a whole new level of abuse, but there was a lot to try to get me back. And I opted out of doing that. I'm grateful that whatever was inside of me was saying, no, this is it. This is it. And then we worked our way from there into the courts gradually.
Throughout the time in your relationship, looking back now in hindsight, did you ever feel like there were signs headed towards physical abuse?
It's the kind of thing where you look at yourself, as a matter of fact, and you say, well, why on earth didn't I leave then? Because there was a point at which I admittedly behaved a little poorly in a situation. There was this parking garage we had parked in. There was this insane rate that they were charging. And at the time, we didn't really have a lot of money. And so you had to be out by a certain time or they would charge you another $30, which was at that time for us an insane amount of money because of, where we were at. And so what ended up happening was we were in line just before our deadline, before they were about to do the charge. And there was one person, they were taking forever. By the time we actually got to the window, we were past the time, so they were trying to charge us the $30. And I had this desperate moment where I was like, I don't have the money for this. So I realized I actually had a second key, and in my mind, it was worth it to just let them have the key. So I simply headed for my car to go get it. And they saw what I was doing. And they sent one of their people out, and this guy made, it was a series of mistakes, really. This guy made the mistake of physically pushing me aside and it wasn't actually a big deal. He just kind of pushed me aside. He wasn't even trying to push me. He was just trying to take my key out of my ignition. So it was this ugly moment. But what ended up happening went wildly over the top of this ridiculous situation in which my ex just grabbed his shirt by, the lapels and very shockingly aggressively shoved him so far back. And immediately, because again, the whole situation was just ridiculous, this poor guy put his hands up and was all like, no, that is not where I'm at with this. And my ex was just livid, the look on his face. And it was frightening. And I remember we got in the car and we started our long drive back. And I just couldn't say a word. And I was surprised I was driving because my hands on the wheel were the only thing that was keeping them from trembling, from him seeing that I was just like, who am I sitting next to in this car. But then you have to look at, it's not as simple as let me dump him by the road if you're a decent person, but that love bombing. I'm an empath. Many, abuse targets are, but I'm also an empath with, as I mentioned, the poor boundaries, who is a very smart person who is very successful. And so if you combine the fact that you've got poor boundaries and you don't know it, you're an empath and you don't know it, but gosh darn it, you're smart, you're extremely successful, and everybody's telling you that, then you do trust what your brain is telling you. And if new information is shoving aside the violent episode you just saw, and this person is returning to the person who you believe you are falling in love with, what's your choice going to be?
Yeah.
To believe that this was a blip on the radar and even he is freaked out by what happened and it'll never happen again? Or that you are furthering your path with an abuser?
Yeah.
So I made what the obvious choice is, which is to trust that this person is who they say they are.
Right.
And I think when we blame victims, we're basically saying, you got to stop trusting these people who are lovely and wonderful. And that does not make sense.
You have left this relationship with your child. You're staying at your friend's place. You finally mustered the courage to have that one conversation with him, let him know that everything is fine and, you're safe, you're okay, but you're not coming back home. What happens then?
Right off the bat, I started seeing, I don't know, just within a week, like 2 or 3 lawyers to say, what am I doing here? They were kind of shrug emojis. They were kind of like, I don't know. You're saying that there's abuse here, but we don't see it. Do you have hospital records? Do you have bruises? It's like, I do not. I went through a lot of lawyers and, but they all said the same thing. They all said, basically you have 2 choices. You can pick up and run, which I know one lawyer told me, which later on I realized she could have gotten in a lot of trouble for telling me that. But she kind of understood, and she said, I understood what you're going through, but the courts are not going to. So this is your opportunity to go. You guys don't have an agreement. You're not married. But that didn't feel right to me. I did end up, from the advice of many different lawyers, figuring out how do we figure out some sort of a schedule, right? And what kind of visitation can we have here? I got a nanny and we kind of started to put something together, but it was very loosey-goosey. It was the type of thing where he would say, I want to come by and I want to, see him. I want to come by and I want to take him. And it's a very, very dangerous thing to be doing that, right? There's no, I didn't even realize this, but there's no custody agreement at the time. There's nothing on paper, which does allow, in most states and provinces, does allow for that, other parent to quite possibly abscond with a child.
Well, would that not constitute kidnapping though?
If the other person is very good at saying, well, I had permission, this is why, this was always our plan, then I have seen several cases where, as a matter of fact, no, it did not constitute kidnapping. But don't get me wrong, the courts are kind of like, but sir, you must, figure out a way for her to see her child. But there isn't a whole heck of a lot of follow-up with that. And the repercussions, there's a difference between genders for what the repercussions are for if you do take the child and decide that now you're the primary caregiver. So it becomes this fight for one of the parents, and the other one, it becomes about protection. The child turns into a possession, and it's no longer about, let's allow this child the stability they've had. So then statistically, if it's the woman, then in this, scenario, in many scenarios, what we're saying is that these children have been with mom has dropped them off to school, mom has picked them up, mom takes them to their activities, mom registers for them for their activities, you name it.
Yeah.
And now the other parent is kind of like, well, I want what's due me, and that's half. And it's kind of like, how is that good for the children? Yeah. The courts and abusers tend to argue that 50-50 is in the best interest of children. And it's simply not true. What is better for a human being is to have stability. This argument that we put makes it difficult for children to be protected, for the protective parent to simply continue to allow these children to grow in a way that is healthiest for them. We know that a primary attachment figure is someone who children are able to bond with easily. There's a great study that took a look at a child had a mother who was incarcerated for 7 years, and yet when she came out, they were able to be really kind of reunited and reunified almost right off the bat, because this was the person who had raised the child almost entirely for the first 2 years of their life. The primary attachment is formed in those first 2 years. Mm-hmm. So the primary attachment figure becomes in many ways more important than the primary caregiver. That child is still going to feel more connected to the person they haven't seen for 7 years than the person who is raising them each day. When we take a child away from their primary attachment figure, we're starting to get in some very troubling territory for the growth of that child, for the mental growth of that child.
You took your child away when he was about 5 months, right? So fairly young. Yes. And there was no agreement, particularly by court at this point. So, no. So at this point, your child was sort of going in between yours and your ex's place.
No, not much. I will say that luckily for me, which you don't see with most people, removing myself from the situation helped alleviate quite a lot. And also, many people deal with narcissists who do very well in public and are high functioning for the most part. And I think, I'm lucky enough to, in some ways, lucky enough that was our situation. So there was an effort to figure out things civilly, while there was also a deep effort to control. And so that control that I had suffered in the relationship was still there, but it was manifesting in a different way. So luckily, there was a certain point at which I filed a petition. I waited until I found the right lawyer, and then we did move forward with it. And then once you are in court, once you filed a petition, that really kind of changes the whole thing.
How were they able to sort of like argue this case then? And how were they able to put this case forward for you?
When people are, many of your listeners will kind of say, okay, you go into family court, you go before the court, everybody, tells their stories, and then the court makes a decision. Yeah. And family court is not like that. There can be quick decisions made, but they are supposed to be temporary decisions. Usually those decisions are not so temporary, but they are called temporary for the time being. But when you go in, you do a petition. Most jurisdictions will then, their system will require that there's some sort of mediation that takes place between the parents so that they can end their time in court and just figure it out amongst themselves.
Yeah, as long as both parties can agree to the terms, we're good.
Yep.
We can move forward.
Yep. And that's 95% of divorcing parents. So out of the 5% that's remaining, 75 to 85% of that lot, they basically have an abuser among them. So out of all the people who are going to court, there is an abuser among them. The problem, however, is that the court sees these couples as two problem parents, two arguing parents, and they call them a high conflict divorce. That is not an accurate way to talk about the custody battle. It is not that it is a high conflict custody battle. It is that it is a custody dispute with a high conflict parent.
Yeah, one.
So you usually have a protective parent who has escaped abuse, and then you have a high conflict parent, an abusive parent who, the other party's trying to protect the children against.
Right.
That's going to make a case go a while. So then what does that look like? The mediation does not usually end in anything. If it does, it's because the protective parent was browbeaten into something. If it doesn't, which is the majority of the time, it's because the protective parent stood up and said, no, it isn't going to happen this way. Or if they did come to an agreement, because the abusive parent didn't get every little tiny thing they wanted, they refused to sign. Nevertheless, the court still tries to get the parents to figure it out so that it doesn't go to trial. If it becomes clear that's not going to happen, then often there are two professionals who are introduced. Some sort of a guardian ad litem, which is basically someone who is protecting the child, whether that's a lawyer for the child or some other professional who is representing the child's wishes or making sure that the children are protected. The other professional is a custody evaluator. This is where each parent separately spends several hours in several interviews with an investigator of sorts who is asking them a whole lot of questions about everything and anything you can imagine from their childhood on up. They will also talk to witnesses and collaterals, is what we call them. That basically would be teachers and nannies and doctors and neighbors and etc. They will do a home visit separately with each parent to see them with the children. They may even add the children having a visit with that evaluator alone in their offices with them. They'll have them do a questionnaire. They'll also have them do a whole bunch of personality tests, right? But what's important to know is that 85 to 90% of judges will go along with whatever the evaluator recommends for custody.
But that's so flawed in itself because the evaluators can also be swayed very easily because they're spending a lot of time with the abuser that has learned the skill of grooming in a sense. Like they can groom the evaluator as well into believing what they want them to believe. So
of course, when we work with our parents, they're always like, how can they not see through them? And we have to gently remind them, well, you didn't see through them at first. It took you most people honestly say a year or just over a year when they suddenly realize what the problem is, but by then they have children with this person, right? The truth is, most of these evaluators are people who might be in the psychology profession, and there's not a lot of training about narcissistic abuse. Did they take abnormal psychology? And if they did, NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, or any of the other cluster B personality disorders are one lesson one day, one chapter, right? So this isn't the type of thing where you're coming across people who are well studied in these cluster B personality disorders. And if anything, when people are forced to or really want to have an evaluator come in, I always tell them, if you can, try to get an LCSW. Try to get a licensed clinical social worker because these people recognize trauma.
Right.
These people are in a better position anyway to be able to see through someone who is abusive because, man, have they been through it. And many of them heartbreakingly have learned the hard way that they were fooled. So anyway, to continue. So they'll go through that. And then that is going to lead to one of two things. Well, it'll lead to a settlement conference because once you have that evaluator's report in your hands, both lawyers are going to say the same thing to their clients, which is to say, the judge is just going to go along with us. We'll have a settlement agreement. We'll sign it. We'll take it into the court and get the judge's stamp on it so that it becomes a court order. If you're unable to settle, once again, just like with mediation, then you're very likely to end up in a trial.
What's this trial stage look like?
And the way that a trial looks, it depends. But if I were to give you the basics of what we most often see, then, both parents obviously they testify, they give, testimony, they are cross-examined. Experts are brought in, evidence is presented. You might see PIs. A lot of clients, they don't like to go and get a PI because they're expensive. But almost invariably, the money you spend on a PI shortens your case so much that you save thousands upon the tens of thousands of dollars, actually, because what they find forces the other side to settle more in the child's favor and the protective parent's favor.
What do you think would be the ideal sort of like system structure that should be in place for, for the separation and protection of a child? Like from the beginning to the end, what do you think is the most efficient and the most effective sort of method that can be done in the most fairest way?
It may astound you to know that domestic violence experts are nowhere to be found in the majority of family court cases, in spite of the statistics I gave you before about the fact that the people who enter a court case are the people who are being abused. Right? The other people don't need the court. So that's one of the fixes I would make. I would
Yeah.
say that what we need to do is we need to train DV experts, and we need to have the judges trained as well, so that there is a conversation, so that there is a system that doesn't make it so that there's this 7 or 10-day trial, finds a way to streamline it while still getting at the truth and being as effective as a 7 to 10-day trial. I can't tell you how many parents have a restraining order that does not include the children, because the court has determined that he only beat her up, not the children. And it's kind of like, well, who do you think he's going to beat up when you remove the mom? You know, the children who we know from, several studies are told not to keep their mouths shut when they're suffering these abuses. So the whole system obviously is a mess in different ways. But I think we can look at it and we can say, well, isn't that what CPS does? And I know you've spoken with Kevin in the past, and what do these people do? What do these people do? And the truth is that there's almost too many players at the table, right? But there just aren't the right players at the table. And the ones who you would think are the right players they're not given leave to do their jobs in the right way. But at the heart of it, none of these people are trained in coercive control. None of these people are trained in hidden physical abuse. None of these people are trained in financial abuse. Basically, the court sees this lovely, amazing, charming person who is psychotic and an abuser against this traumatized, all over the place, can barely remember her last name, and has her neuroses are right out there on the table. And suddenly she's the unfit parent, when in reality, she's a wonderful parent, right? So really what we need is just this intensive training and a streamlining, so that if you're in court, there should be a DV expert on this case right off the bat.
No, that's really, really interesting. I think that's a very fair sort of like assessment of this. I think like even when you were talking about in trial, right? Like having all different kinds of parties involved.
They do talk to, or they should anyway, if they're doing the right things, then they are talking to the teachers. They are talking to the therapists. They are talking to the sitters and the neighbors and that type of thing. So I think it's important to understand. Let's take just as one example, schools. These teachers are not supposed to be sharing these things, right? They can be a mandated reporter, but, we don't see them on the stand. And the argument is it's the school's policy. We don't like to do it. Families need to feel that their kids are safe there, and not that, they could be in danger of losing their children. It's an interesting thing to see, well, who can they talk to, who will come forward, and who will not answer their calls. I think it goes hand in hand with what I said earlier, was how surprised we were at first, and how we continue to be surprised at the atrocities that these mothers, these parents and their children go through. And yet they still are kind of like, but how can we keep the abuser involved? How can we keep the abusive parents involved? And it's because I think, these parents recognize that, and we know from studies that children who are beaten into the hospital still love the parent who put them there. They just hate the behavior. They just hate what put them there. And so, yes, if we can get abusive parents to even just employ cognitive empathy, then that's going to make things better for these children when they are spending parenting time with a parent who is controlling, gaslighting, blaming, abusive, cruel, and even physically abusive as well. Can we help these parents at least behave in a way that will give these children some respite from the abuse?
Okay, final question. Can you tell us if there's anyone here listening today that maybe is probably seeing signs and considering leaving a relationship that they feel is not serving them? What message can you offer? What advice can you offer them today?
Yeah, if we're catching people who are who haven't left yet, the major piece of advice I can give them is get as much evidence as you can right now before you go, because it gets a lot harder to get evidence of what's going on in the household once you leave. Get copies of all the papers, licenses and statements and stuff like that. We focus on the custody piece, but get as much evidence as you can that you are the primary caregiver, because man, do a lot of these abusers like to say that they were actually the primary caregiver. And the other thing I would say is, when you are working with court professionals, when you're working with even your own lawyer, and they're saying, we're going to have to go this way because this is what the court wants, you should absolutely speak up and say respectfully, I want to partner with you and not just receive what you have to say. I want us to work together. And for this, I'm going to say no. The reason I hired you was to achieve this result.
Yeah, I can imagine like a lot of people that are like on the verge of leaving are probably feeling pretty wired up and anxious and are not thinking about these sort of like, the really practical steps that are going to be necessary and absolutely useful down the line. Thank you so much, Renee, for being on the podcast and sharing such wonderful insight with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. If we have helped even just one of your listeners.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Chris Trzynski, Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.